Cool. All right. So tonight, very informal chat. Just go here, Slido, Culture Amp. You don't need to download anything and ask the questions. We crowdsource them. Top ones, just thumbs up and thumbs down. The ones you like and don't like. Didier, thanks for coming, man.
My pleasure. I should have a doobie if I'm going to try and come up after Elon Musk.
Well, that's true. That's true. I don't know what do you think. The stock prices for Culture Amp, they go up or down? I did see somewhere that he had some cannabis investments. So it was, I don't know how,
He's a smart businessman.
Yeah, he's smart. So tonight, I just wanted to go through your story. And we've got a lot of entrepreneurs in the audience, and then I want to kind of geek out a bit on people and culture and community if we can. And I'm sure that's what drew a few people here tonight especially to your your mission and what Culture Amp does. But let's go back. I usually start with the question: was there a mother or father that was an entrepreneur?
So
it's very hit or miss. I don't know why I start with that.
No, it's an interesting question for me. Both my parents were very influential in what I ended up doing. My mum was an entrepreneur and my mum was an artist. She was a visual artist. So she grew up in Victoria as a farmer's daughter, which she didn't want to be. And so she fled to Japan, became a kimono painter in Japan. And interestingly, met my dad in Japan. He was Dutch and she's Australian, and he was studying psychology. And after going out for 6 months, he said to her, "Would you like a trip to Europe?" And she said, "Sure." So, well, if we're married, the Dutch government will pay. So why don't we get married on the way? So they got married at the registry office and then flew there and then came back to Australia. And she's been a visual artist her whole life. And the reason I would say she's the entrepreneurial thing for me is, that is, you pour everything you have into that and you get nothing in return. Choosing to be a professional artist in that way is true entrepreneurship, I think. And so for me, that probably did frame a lot of what I think about.
Well, you've also got the curse of the entrepreneur in not liking what you shipped after you ship it as the artist, right? It's like, shit, I could have done that better, that painting or whatever.
It's a lot harder when you've done it on silk in Gouda and finished it and it can't be changed.
Absolutely. And then what was your is there a moment where you kind of leaned into entrepreneurship early? Was there a baseball card story or one of those growing up, selling lemonade stand?
No, I never went that traditional thing. But if I look back, probably the thing that was quite seminal, although I didn't realize it, and if I don't stop and think, I don't even notice it when I look back over my life. When I was in high school, my dad being Dutch has a real issue with school uniforms. Like for him, school uniforms are this English public school, private school kind of idea. And so I didn't wear uniform all through high school. And if you go to a public school in South Australia, they can't force you to if your parents don't want you to.
Right.
And so once again, if I stop and think about it, it's not something that occurs to me, but then I do realize that for 5 years, I was forced to be one of only the few people in the room that didn't do it. And the interesting thing was it didn't really bother me, but it did, I think, set up part of my thinking around the fact that you don't have to do things the way other people do them. And you should be okay with trying things that other people might think are silly. And for me, it probably came from that, just a willingness and a desire to do different things, as opposed to a hustling, make money from the beginning. We were really poor as a family. We didn't have a lot of money.
So this is Adelaide,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? And so what, you were just wearing jeans and sneakers, and everyone's got their uniform on?
Yeah.
Didn't occur to you?
That's the funny thing. I look back and it goes, really, if I had to draw the picture, I'd have to stop and go, was I wearing a uniform? Oh no, I wasn't wearing a uniform. No, that's right.
Yeah, and the principal just like, I can't be
He hated it.
dealing
He hated
with
it.
the Dutch guy again.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, and then what was the education?
What did I study? So I went through high school. In year 12, I did Maths 1, Maths 2, Physics, English and Art. I did very well in English and Art. I actually got perfect scores for both of those, and then reasonably well in Maths 1 and Maths 2 and Physics. And I thought about going into art, but I'd seen the life that my mum went through, and I don't have the courage to do that. And so I did computer science.
So computer science?
At university.
Yeah. And then coming out, so programming background, technical background. Wow. And then so how do you end up doing pictures?
Going to write some pictures. Yeah. So I guess it was funny because I'd given up on the arts piece, I guess. And full circle now, I'm actually now just joined the Council of Trustees at the National Gallery of Victoria here, which is fantastic because the art world is something that's always been important to me. So I went to University of Computer Science. I did a lot of points outside the department, anthropology, philosophy, politics, etc. In my last year, I started working for Apple on campus. So I was the student rep for Apple. They used to have this thing where you'd be student rep for Apple. And so I was working for Apple. The company that owned them also sold Sun and SGI and other things. And I went along to one of their events, Comtech, and I met somebody who was doing computer-generated imagery. So they were working on commercials. I'm like, that's cool. Can I come and check it out? And so they had an office in Kensington, in Adelaide. Kensington in Adelaide. And so I went out and checked out this office and had a look at it. And it was this actually kind of funny. I've told this story to a few people, so some people may have heard me tell this story, but I went along with a friend of mine and we looked at the whole place, top and bottom. And Tony Clark, who was one of the founders, was there. And at the end, they had a little O2, which is an Silicon Graphics computer, if anyone can remember. And there was a Jazz drive, which is an optical drive, if anyone can remember those, sitting next to it. And I looked at it and I said, are you having trouble with the Jazz drive? And he's like, yeah, I can't get the damn thing to work. I'm like, what version of IRIX are you running on the O2? And he's like, 6.2. And I'm like, you're going to have to upgrade it to 6.3. You're not going to be able to get the Jazz drive to work. And we walk out and my friend's like, what the hell was that? And I said, well, actually I was reading a news group yesterday and I saw somebody post that. So it's literally the only thing I knew about Silicon Graphics computers and Jazz drives. But I figured it was a good time to use it. And Tony kind of called me and said, hey, do you want a job, basically? And so they hired me as a sysadmin.
And you said, sorry, Bob, I've given you everything I knew yesterday.
No, you just have to learn fast. And so I joined as employee number 5 or 6, worked as a software engineer. My very first job was to write a rainbow shader, and then I had to write a control system for a motion control thing. Got in there, had fun, went into compositing. 8 years later, I was running the company.
Isn't that awesome though? That just some universe manifest. How can the one thing that you learned before you had to walk into that thing? You know what I mean? It's crazy.
I think I've realized that that's a trick that has got me through a lot, which is if you know one thing deep down in something and you reveal that in a careful and simple way, then people will just assume you know everything else. You just have to back yourself to learn everything else when you need to. And that's got me through a lot of things.
These little nuggets of gold. Mm-hmm. That's great. So you went through, learned computer animation, but Rising, so this is Rising Sun, yeah?
Yes.
But you were doing some big movies.
We did. So after we started doing commercials and interactive CD-ROMs and all that sort of stuff, and then the people that founded that company came from a background of film. So Tony Clark was a cinematographer. They had all come together, and actually I learned a lot about culture here too, because the reason they started Rising Sun Pictures is they'd worked for another company that did some phenomenal stuff with motion control rigs. But the culture itself was very tough, and it was a really difficult place to work. So when they founded Culture Amp, that's me. When they founded Rising Sun Pictures, their whole idea on how to build Rising Sun Pictures was just to do the reverse of the company they'd come from. So that their kind of whole thing was, we just want to build a company that doesn't work like the company I just left. And so, that whole process of coming in and doing it, they were big on film. It was a big part of their thing. And so after several years, we started doing Australian films, and then we started working on American films. And it's a relatively small industry. So once you find your feet, you find people coming back to you. And by the end of it, we were probably one of the 10 or 15 companies in the world, most credited companies in the world on Hollywood visual effects films.
Wow. Can you talk about some of the
so Harry Potter, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, Lord of the Rings. So we did Return of the King. That actually saved the company. The Batman films, 28 Days Later, which was a particularly interesting one for me to work on, Blood Diamond, Last Samurai, Charlotte's Web. Charlotte's Web, if anybody has seen the live adaptation, it's an American film, that was the film that grew us from 30 people to 150 in 12 months. So a lot of what I learned about people and culture came from that experience.
Well, talk about that. There's 2 things I want to, if you don't mind, kind of uncovering. One, you said almost saved the company. Mm-hmm. So this wasn't without struggles, and this one, 10x the company. So can you go through some of the the good times and the bad times there, if you don't
Yeah,
mind.
of course. No, I'm happy to share these things. So the reason Lord of the Rings saved the company was, I remember coming into work early, so I was a compositor at the time, and I would often get into work at 6 or 7 when no one else was there, so I could actually get stuff done. And I came in to work on a film, and I start set up. It's like 6 in the morning or something. Start setting things up, hit render. At that point, a render takes like an hour and a half, so I have to do something else. So I start flicking through the news groups, and I see there's this insane flame war going on. These two people are just killing each other. I'm like, what is going on? And then I'm like, this doesn't sound strange. So I run over the TV and I turn the TV on, and it was September 11, September 12 here. And it was in between the two hits. So the first plane had hit, and the second plane, I pretty much was turning the TV on as the second plane had hit. And that was obviously a transformative thing for the world at large, and obviously for the US. But if you think about the film industry is a confidence game. So constantly the studios and these people are bankrolling $150 million things that a year or a year and a half or 2 years later are going to be in the cinema. So what happened off the back of 9/11 was that nobody was writing checks, nobody was green-lighting anything because they didn't know what the future was going to hold. And it only took a few months and eventually stuff got going. So what happened was that kind of floated through like an air pocket in the film industry. And in visual effects, you're at the end of the chain. And so a year and a half later, there was just no work. There was just nothing. Like there was no films that were in post-production that could afford to have companies working on it. And so, we thought we had this, and then that fell over, and this fell over, and we got to the point where we had about 30 people at the time, and I'd pretty much just been made general manager, and I had to turn to all the stuff that we had and say, we don't know how we're going to pay everybody next week. Like, we've tried everything. We don't have enough money left. We've got just enough money to figure out how to do this. And so we sort of sat down with everybody, and those people that had kids, we kept paying. People that could afford not to, we did something. Some people left and went to other companies. And literally 2 days later, we got a call from Weta saying, we can't finish the film in time. Can we get you to quote on some work? And like a week later, we were signed up on Return of the King, and we were cranking shots out as fast as we could. And so that saved the company because we basically would have had to shut it. That happened 3 times.
Wow.
Charlotte's Web was the reverse of that. We landed this film, started working on it, and it just grew and it grew and it grew. And then to be able to do all the work that they needed done, we had to 10x the size of the company. Well, not 10x, but 5x the size of the company. And we did that in 18 months. And I remember thinking at the time, because I was still pretty young, like in my mid-20s, and CEO of the company, and we've like doubled and tripled and quadrupled the size of the company. And
you got a Benz.
I am good. Like, this is easy. And you don't realize until the music stops how all the mistakes you've made, because you can kind of paste everything over while you're growing like crazy. You're like, you just keep doing more of stuff. And then it's not until things go the other way that you're like, shit, I did this wrong, I did that wrong, I should have done this, I should have done that. And so, learn a lot from that.
So, so you had the experience with, having to try and let people go, or maybe giving them a call up and say, oh, just kidding. we figured it out.
We actually kept everybody. One person went to another company because they had to, but everybody else we kept, and we ended up not paying everyone. So it was a situation where we were able to turn around fast enough that we got through it, but it was hard.
Tough times, right? Tough times with people, and then the scaling bit. Was Culture Amp next, or was there something in between?
So I did that for 13 years. And 3 years before I finished at Rising Sun, I went through Entrepreneur of the Year, the EY program.
Right.
And so we were selected into that, and I went to the Nationals. And I was actually here in Melbourne, they had a masterclass. And so we're here for the masterclass, and at the end of the masterclass, there was drinks and stuff afterwards. And there was 2 young guys by the name of Mike Cannon-Brooks and Scott Farquhar. And we were literally the 3 last people left. Everybody else had gone to bed. So we were sitting there drinking and chatting. And I became really good friends with them. And then over the next 3 years, I watched them continue to build their company. And when I met them, Atlassian and Rising Sun Pictures were roughly the same size. So we're doing about $20 million a year in revenue. They're a software company and I'm a services business. And so 3 years later, I'm a slow learner, I'm like, I think your business model is better than my business model. You have a monotonic revenue curve, and I'm building a service business which sucks for Hollywood, which is even harder. And that was the point where I went, I'm still young, I can afford to fail, I'm going to go do something else. I had built another software company along the way. So as part of, while we're at Rising Sun Pictures, with the founders of Rising Sun Pictures, I co-founded a software company, initially trying to solve color management problem. And so once again, it was a personal issue. I was a compositor working on film, and I could see this thing, and then I would send it, because at this point we still actually filmed it out to real film. And so we would send it away, it would get printed, and then we'd get it back, and then we'd take it to the cinema and we'd look at it and go, that's not the shade of orange that I wanted. And we'd go back and we'd change it. And when we're working on a Hollywood film, that stuff's filmed out in the US, that's a 2-week lag time, which just kills you. There was a company, small company called Kodak, that had a solution to this problem. So for $100,000, they would sell you a thing called a Cineon that did color management and a whole bunch of other stuff. So we said, we'll buy a Cineon, please. And they said, oh, we're not selling them anymore. And I found out years later that somebody high up at Kodak had made the decision that they could elongate the life of analog film by not giving people tools to properly handle the digital piece. And we can see how well that worked out for them. And there's actually, sorry, just as an aside, when I think back, the 2 companies that I had that kind of real weird moment when I saw, one was when Rackspace bought SGI for $10 million. And then the second one was when Kodak filed for bankruptcy. Just to see the Schadenfreude of somebody that was like the biggest, fastest, best, most amazing company in the world just come shutting to earth. And so what happened is I talked to Tony about it, and Tony said, well, let's just write it. So I went and found a big, thick, fat book on the reproduction of color, and we wrote a color management system to do that for ourselves. And then we figured, well, if we need it, other people need it. So we started selling that to other companies. And so we built that, and we built a CineSync, which is a synchronized QuickTime player.
Is it still, they still going?
Mm-hmm. We sold the color management software to THX, but CineSync, which is a synchronized QuickTime player, still exists and won a Technical Academy Achievement Award. And there's, I think, 6 people in Adelaide who still work on that. So that still exists. But part of my insight was I had this great software company, but I didn't think selling tools to people making films was going to be the place where I could make enough dents in the universe. And so part of going out to start Culture Amp was, I want to build a software company, but what am I passionate about? And what is something that I can really focus on that will help more people? And I kept coming back to the idea that as a CEO, you're a glorified psychiatrist. And so I was interested in people and culture, and so that's what I wanted to go build a company around.
Where do you think that came from? I mean, like,
my dad's a psychologist.
No. I mean, the love or wanting to, it almost, I kind of related to like a Silicon Valley kind of pay it forward, or like, it's like a, where does that wanting to help people in like in your, you know, having a purpose-driven company, where did that come from?
The purpose bit is kind of separate. So for me, the reason I wanted to build a people and culture company was not that I saw that as the way I could help the most people in the world, honestly. It was that was where I saw the opportunity to create a bigger company. Like, I was running a 200-person, $20 million company at the time. So the question for me was, if I'm going to leave this to go do something else, I want to build something that would have 1,000 people or 2,000 people and help be bigger than that. What is a vision and a dream in a market that can support that? Now, you turn that back around, how do I think you need to do that? That's where the people and the culture and the purpose bit comes in. Because I think that if you're not doing it that way, if you're not trying to create a company that believes in those things, you won't succeed. But it wasn't for me sitting down saying, necessarily, I want to build a company to change the world in that way. I had the world's most naive business plan. My business plan was 10,000 by 10,000 equals 100 million. I can just build a company where tens of thousands of companies will spend tens of thousands of dollars a year. We'll have hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. That sounds simple. And that was literally, I wish I had the piece of paper. I wrote that down before I knew what the product was. Yeah. And we should hit, it'll be slight different variation. It'll probably be more like 5 by 20, but we should hit that in the next 2 years.
That's awesome. It was just to me because I know everyone, like, I think mostly now, entrepreneurs are starting to think more about purpose and stuff when they're starting, but I don't think that was, 10 years ago wasn't the case. It was just...
I think the big difference that we're seeing, this is obviously going into the space that we play in, but the lens that we give to people is oftentimes you sit down and say, I want to build a financially successful company. And you start there, that's great, but at a certain point you're like, well, ultimately that's a lag indicator. So what is it that leads to that outcome, even if that's the thing you care about more than anything else? And this probably happened 40, 50 years ago, but people started realizing that if you want to be financially successful, you have to be customer centric. You actually have to understand the person you're creating value for, and you have to do that well. And I think what we're getting to now is that people are realizing, well, even that in itself is a bit of a lag indicator, and this is not new. This stuff was done in the 70s and the 80s with the service profit chain model and other ideas, but it's this idea that if you actually want to be truly customer centric, you actually have to put culture first. And so culture is the biggest lever you have to build a successful company. Now, I'm not somebody who sits down and goes, my life's goal is to make X million dollars in profit or whatever. The only reason I want to build a big company now, and this is kind of somewhat transformed for me as I've gone through the process, is that's what gives you the right for other people to pay attention to what you're doing and why you're doing it. So what matters to me is that I want to win and I want to play at the highest level and I want to win at that level. But the most important thing to me and the legacy that I want to leave is the type of company we are when we're playing that game. And if we do it right, we get a chance to change the way the game is played. And that's a little bit of what you're talking about, which is that people are realizing that to build a successful business now, it's not enough to make a profit. That in some ways is the easy part. The question is, what are you doing with that? And how did you get there? And what did you have to burn to get there? 200 years ago, 300 years ago, if you wanted to build a company, no one cared that you destroyed the environment. Nobody cared that you were enslaving other people. Nobody cared that you were doing all these other things. They just said, how much money are you making us? And over time, we've increasingly understood that's a very narrow-minded, very painful way to solve these problems. And we're now realizing you do have to care about the environment. You can't enslave people. That is not nice, and it won't work well for you. We also have to treat people in a different way. Even now, unless I'm going on my own rant now, I'll stop and go back.
That's great.
Is we're realizing that mental illness and mental well-being is something that is integral in the way people have to work. And we have responsibility as a company to think about, and as an organization, to think about the world that we're creating for everybody that works here and trying to help them with these things. Because it's not just that a few people suffer from mental illness. We all do in some way, shape or form. And it's something that we all have to deal with. So all of that stuff I think is coming home to roost now.
Absolutely. Can we go back a bit to the formative years of, or even just, aside from the 10,000 times 10,000, what was the thinking around starting Culture Amp and what you wanted to achieve, and just a bit of the early days stuff?
I think the thing that I spent a lot of time on when I was in film and at Rising Sun was I was heavily inspired by the early Agile thinking. I remember reading the first version of the Agile Manifesto. What really hit home for me was this idea that, does anybody know who Alistair Cockburn is? So Alistair Cockburn's a guy who was developing at the same time. He did the Crystal Method. But he had this really interesting idea that we kept talking about traditional versus agile. And he had this nice idea that traditional was used as a pejorative, and that really what we should be talking about is disciplined versus agile. And he says a lot of the traditional waterfall development and all these things are what we would call a disciplined process. And so their job is to guarantee an outcome. And there are a lot of situations where you need to do that. If you're designing the system that keeps somebody alive, you want to throw as much resources as you need to guarantee that it's going to work. But in a lot of the problems we're trying to solve, this is what Agile does, is it helps you understand that you're actually willing to give up a certain amount of certainty if you can maximize the value that you make with what you have. And so those ideas really stuck with me. I followed that all the way through to Lean, to the Toyota production system, not what I would call Western Lean, but Eastern Lean, which is really interesting. So if you say to most people, what's the heart of the TPS, or what's the heart of Lean, they'll say it's waste reduction, it's this, it's that. If you speak to Taiichi Ohta, who's the chairman and the founder of Toyota, it's continuous improvement and respect for people. And so it's those two things that create the environment that make this work. And so I got heavily influenced in these ideas that when we're being asked to solve problems at great scales that are rapidly changing, all these sorts of things, there are new and different ways of approaching that problem. And a lot of them anchor on empowering people to solve them in new ways. And so that's what I wanted to do, was help build a company that would help people do those things. And I ended up on this problem because I saw a particular problem, but that was the input for me.
Oh, first, I love that, because you're right. Yeah, I think even Steve Blank was looking at Toyota, and then now we've got this, everyone's kind of fixed on the standard version, right?
Yep.
So the product itself is a mechanism to give feedback to employers, right? If I get,
to get feedback from. So the way we think about it is the problem so originally when I started the company, the problem I was trying to solve was performance development, performance management, performance reviews. Why is it that everybody hates a once a year, universally low, backward looking thing? And why can't that be a continuous coaching conversation? So that was where I started. What we realized, that's a universal solution without a universal answer. And so we actually had paying customers, but it just wasn't getting the traction that we wanted. And we've actually kind of come full circle, and we're working on that problem again in a different guise. We decided that wasn't going to work. We tried a second idea. So it took us, I worked on it for about a year. I met my co-founders, added them on board. We spent another 6 months And then we killed it. So that's the beer talking. And then we had a second idea, which is, has anybody read the Checklist Manifesto? 1, 2, good. It's a great book if you haven't read it. Adil Gawand, who's an amazing writer, a surgeon for the New York Times, talks about quality, and he comes back and says, when we're trying to deal with complex situations, there is actually quite a simple and powerful idea to try and solve these problems called a checklist. And he goes in and talks about them in aeronautics and how they're used, and all this. It's a really, really good book. And so our whole idea was, what if we could build GitHub for processes? What if process management was not a heavy, hardcore thing, but the simple thing of documenting what you're doing and then sharing that with somebody else? Which is a kind of cool idea, but we realized that it was a little too abstract and a little too high. So we killed that in 6 weeks. So 6 months to kill the first, 6 weeks to kill the second. And then we came back to an idea that I'd had earlier, but it shelved, which is kind of the first problem, but at the organizational level. So how does the organization turn a once a year universally low backward looking thing into more of a continuous conversation? And so we started focusing on this issue of employee engagement, and we built a platform to help people capture that and measure it and improve it. And then as we expanded out, we realized that much more than just engagement, it was about employee feedback in all its forms. So when you join the company, when you leave the company, how you feel about each other, how you feel about your manager, how you feel about your team. So how do we help you collect, understand, but most importantly, how do we help you act on that employee feedback so that you can improve and build a better culture? And so for us, that's been the journey on the product.
So is that a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, quarter? It depends
all
on
of the above, depends on what you're trying to solve, and it's usually a mixture of those things. But essentially at its heart, this is a platform to allow companies to collect that feedback wherever they need it, to understand that feedback, and then to act on that feedback.
And this would align with a lot of tech companies, say, using OKRs and stuff like that?
That's a really funny one, you should say that. So it's different to that in the sense that what you're actually trying to do is not measure, has everybody shipped enough widgets, which is kind of often how the OKR stuff gets rolled out, but how do you feel? Because what the good companies are doing, like we have, 10 PhDs in psychology in the company, we've got at least that many masters in psych. So you've got to start from a research point of view, and we have a kind of IO psych background to it, but it's not just a psychologist in an ivory tower telling you what makes people happy. What great companies are doing is they're saying, this is the experience I want my people to have, and I want to measure if it's occurring. I want to know where in the company I'm not delivering that experience. That's what we help people do.
Wow. So you're doing this for some big companies, right? Can you talk about some of the big wins there, and then maybe how that's implemented and how they're trying to get that culture aligned with what you just said?
Yeah, I mean, we work with 1,700 customers globally now. Everything from 20 person to 100,000 people at top end. Here in Australia, I think we have 12 of the AFL teams. Cirque du Soleil, Pixar, many of the companies in the Valley. We started working with Airbnb where there were 100 people. They're now, 4,000. We worked with Box, a lot of different companies. Adobe was a really interesting one for us. So we started working with them probably 9 months into the life of the company. When we won them as a customer, they had more people on the team on the project than we had in the company. And I remember we had a big debate because one of my co-founders, John, was in Vancouver, and we were chatting to Adobe and they're like, can you come to San Jose and pitch to us on this idea? And we had this meeting where we're like, it's gonna cost $600 to fly to San Jose. Is this really a good use of our funds? I think it was the best $600 we spent. So we went and we pitched and we got them as a customer, and we still work with them today. And so a lot of that is helping them understand where things are working and what they can do to make that better. And if you look across the industry, we produce these benchmark reports and we help people see it. And a lot of it comes down to understanding, are you creating an environment where people can grow as people? That's probably the biggest driver towards whether or not they're engaged.
Can I sidetrack it a little bit? Because it's intriguing to me when you're so early on. I think a lot of the founders here the dream is to land Disney and McDonald's and all that. Can you talk about some of the process you're using, even when you said you didn't have enough people to land Adobe, or like something that would be, a bit of a takeaway, I guess. Something that's worked for you.
Yeah, so one thing that's been true for me, both at Rising Sun and at Culture Amp, people used to say, how did you end up working on Hollywood films from Adelaide? Or how does a company in Melbourne get Adobe as a client? The most important thing was that we were too naive to know that we couldn't. So I can guarantee you that there's a whole bunch of other people that could have got them as a client. There's a whole bunch of other people that could have done it, but they decided that they weren't going to and didn't try and didn't turn up. So that's the first thing, and always that's been a big part of it is you've got to show up, you've got to turn up, you've got to try. And I don't mean that in the sense that you can get anything you want. This is the second part. The second part is you can get anything you want that you're willing to hurt for. And some things hurt a lot. Like it takes a long time to get those things. And the early days were not easy. Even if you have Adobe, you might not have other customers. Your revenue's not growing. You're going, are we doing what we need to do? So there's a macro piece of just turning up. Some of the micro piece, I remember being on a call with Adobe and they're like, are you sure you can do this? Are you sure you can pull this off? And I was actually in Sweden at the time at my best friend's wedding. And I'm like, look, I've worked for Steven Spielberg. I've had to deliver stuff that he asked for that's totally unreasonable. I guarantee you whatever you need, we can do. And it literally is, at some point they just have to trust you and you just have to find a way to get them to trust you. Now, I knew that we could do it because I had 3 co-founders that worked as enterprise architects at large companies here. They'd had to solve all these problems before. We knew that we could get through it with enough effort and enough brute force. We just had to convince them to do so. And so that's really what I put all my effort into, is I just need to get you to believe me.
Sorry, so I cut you off with your original story around how you get in these big companies to change their some wins with the culture and stuff. And
I mean, a lot of it, some of it obviously I can't divulge, but a lot of it comes down to, and I can give you a specific example which I think kind of crystallized this for me. We had a particular client, looked at the data and they said, okay, there's some stuff here. There's a particular manager that is not connecting with their staff and the staff aren't connecting with them. And so I said to the CEO, okay, is this new? Did you know this? And she's like, I've known this for 2 years. Okay. So what are you going to do now? She's like, I'm going to do something about it. And for me, that was the heart. Like, we're not giving data that suddenly blows somebody's mind that they've never known this before. But by using a tool like Culture Amp, they've now got data to actually be able to sit down and go, look, we can't just keep ignoring this. This needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be dealt with now. And that for me is probably the heart of where we see the real change happen, that people can use a tool to actually make that realization and do something about it. And this is true no matter what your culture is. Like oftentimes people say, culture is soft and fluffy. My favorite answer to that, one of our clients is the Oakland Raiders. Now, for those that don't know the US, the Oakland Raiders is the Collingwood to the 10th degree version of American sports. Like, they're the least liked, most mean, they've been kicked out of 3 cities. No, they've switched cities 3 times. Like, they are the toughest, nastiest, hardest football team in America. They use Culture Amp to think about people and culture. If they care about it, you can care about it.
Absolutely. And what about, because I've had this, when we talk about people, hiring and firing, or, there wasn't a culture fit, when someone's just it seems like they're the CTO or they're so dependable on this person, how do big companies handle that when those reports come back like that?
That that it comes back and says your CTO's
he's an asshole and
wow, that's a funny.
Or someone that's kind of pivotal to the business.
That problem's as old as time itself. Like, the interesting challenge I think we're seeing now is because of Glassdoor, because of all of the stuff that's come out in many industries, particularly the tech industry. Boards are slowly waking up to the fact that they have to be accountable to the company and the culture that's been created. And one of the ways I think about this is that one of the dark sides of the valley is this idea that you should be willing, not just willing, but you should strive to win at any cost. And the problem is that if you choose to win at any cost, at some point you look around and go, shit, the cost got really high. And I think people are starting to realize that actually, no, that's not acceptable. And we need to have conversations up front about what costs we're not willing to bear and how this is going to play out. Because if you want to build a business for the long term, that's going to kill you. And so this is just another piece of it. We're helping surface stuff. We're helping giving a voice to people that maybe don't have a voice. And we're also helping companies be accountable for what they see. So when we talk about what does it mean to be a culture first company, which is one of our big things, part of it is holding up a mirror and being accountable to what you see. We give them the mirror, only they can be accountable to what they see.
And is that, when they finally get rid of this person, does does it naturally, whether they thought they were shit, we're going to lose all these sales, whatever, does it kind of naturally heal itself? What has been the, or is it, I don't know.
The way I would put back on it is, think of it like customer feedback. So 20, 30 years ago, most companies, once a year, the enlightened ones would hire an agency to go talk to a couple of customers and produce a report, and they would talk about it in a management meeting, and then they'd put it in the shelf and do nothing about it. Now, you go to the coffee bar on the corner and they're running real-time analytics on their NPS score, because people know that they need to have that data, they want to use it, they want to improve themselves. That's what we're doing, we're just doing it for culture. So it's not necessarily that it's a big thing and you run this thing and there's this person you have to get rid of and now your job's done. It's like, how are you running your company without knowing what's working and what's not working? And what's working today might not work tomorrow. And what's not working today hopefully will work tomorrow if you go and focus on it. So it's really about engaging people in that process.
What are some of the before we jump, I want to jump into some of these questions, but what are some of the wins that you're particularly proud of, with along the way?
In terms of customers, or?
Yeah, in terms of customers and
so Adobe,
using your product. Yeah.
Adobe, as I mentioned, Pixar was big for me given my background and interest.
Sorry, I meant how their software impacted their company.
Okay, I'll give you an example.
Your software.
Yeah, one company that I dealt with, it's actually a kind of very unsexy, traditional factory business with places in a lot of places. And I was talking to the CHRO about it and what she learned. I said, what did you learn from the process? And she said, well, actually, we found out that in one of our offices, one of our factories in one of the countries that they were in, one of the supervisors was harassing women on the particular team that he was responsible for. I'm like, okay, what are you doing about it? And she said, oh, I've already fired him. I went over there, verified it, and I fired him. And I said, you've done more in that one action for your people than any amount of value statement, any amount of, creative brief, all that stuff that we do to try and, that's culture, is like, all right, that's not acceptable, we're gonna do something about it. And so that moment was something that was really powerful to me. The other moments that are great are those ones where you hear people, like one of the things I used to do when I was doing the VC rounds is I'd be talking to the VCs and the staff and blah, blah, blah. And then they'd be going, yeah, but is this a real, do people really care about this? And I'm like, who's your favorite company at the moment in the Valley? Slack. All right, pull up Intercom, search Stuart Butterfield. He was in our tool 2 minutes ago looking at the results on his company. Is that proof for you? And so it's that thing that this is being used, Brian Chesky, whoever it is, these people care because this is something that they need to be able to run their business. And so that was my ego trip, when I could look up somebody that I admired and see that they were using our data to try and make good decisions.
I hope he fucking says Slack. I did say I was going to get to questions, but you touched on something that I kind of been selling along the way, and that's the fundraising side of things. You probably had one of the biggest fundraisers so far, 2018, with the 54 million. And just what can young startups learn about the art of fundraising? Because it seems like you've been able to get the valuations that you would see in the US and not necessarily in Australia. How do you kind of position yourself with that, and what's any techniques you can help us young guns with?
It's hard. We've been lucky. It's also a thing where you realize no matter what you get, you always feel inferior. So there's always somebody else that's managed to get 10 times the valuation on half the revenue and whatever. So it's pretty bad on your ego. And I think about when I go through the fundraising process, if I'm fundraising for 2, 3, 4 months, whatever it is, I refer to it as Schrodinger's cat. I don't know if I'm dead or alive. And it's this really weird psychology where I just get irritable and I grouchy because you're not doing that much work. I mean, you're pitching and so on, but it's a huge amount of existential stress because you just don't know how this is going to net out until you actually sign the deal. And I remember even when we did our Series C round, which was a US $20 million round, and when I finally accepted the term sheet, I was at home here, I live in St Kilda, and my mum was over from Adelaide, and I just made her a cup of tea, and I'm like, all right, you got to give me 10 minutes. I've got to go sign a term sheet for $20 million US. And then I have to call all the people that I'm not taking the term sheet from. And so I did this thing, signed it and stuff, and she comes back and she's like, "You okay?" I'm like, "Yeah." I said, "I assume most people think that when you sign a $20 million term sheet, you're in a G4 over the Pacific with a cigar or something. But the truth of the matter is you feel like shit because yes, you've got this piece of money. It's never as much as you want. It's never as good a valuation as you want. You always feel like you could have negotiated a better deal. And now you're calling 3 people that you've just gone through hell to try and get and give you a term sheet or whatever and say, yes, I know you're a wonderful human being. Yes, you're fantastic. No, I'm not taking your money. No, sorry. Yes, I realize this is the biggest mistake in my life. Yes." You know, and it's this really weird process to go through. So, the biggest piece of advice I would give to people is like, raising money is only one way of building a successful company. You don't have to do it. You shouldn't always do it even. Like if you do it great and do it well, but don't think that that's success. I mean, we talk about it internally. Every time we raise a round, we have a little celebration thing. And the thing I always say is we are not celebrating the fact that we just raised $10 million. The Valley does that way too much. The fact that you raised $10 million has got very little to do with the future success of the company. We should be celebrating what we did with the money, not the money we raised. And so that would be my main thing is like, if you want to do it, great, but don't think it's a fantastic thing. And I had somebody I know here, she called me and said, "Oh, congratulations, you're now one of the most well-funded Australian startups ever." And I'm just like, oh God, like that's a horrible thought. It's a really horrible thought to think that we've raised over $100 million Australian. And I still, probably the way I deal with it is just compartmentalize it and don't think about it.
Oh, I used it to sell the event, man. Sorry. So, on that, does that mean that once you have this big exit, is round 2, round 3, round 4, no exit?
Don't exit.
Don't exit?
That's my approach on this. So Blackbird, who led our last round and has been an investor in most, they wrote this great paper that said F the exit strategy. Like people always ask me, so what's your strategy? You're going to get sold to it? You're going to do a trade sale? You're going to do an IPO? I'm like, I don't want an exit strategy. I want to build a big successful company that lasts as long as possible. I definitely don't want to sell the company. Now, because I have VC investors, because every person in the company is a shareholder, if somebody comes along and wants to put an unreasonable amount of money on the table, I'm compelled to listen. I have no choice. But that's not my desire.
Yep.
I don't even want to list. I mean, the thought of having, we could ask our friends at Zendesk how much fun it is having to meet the market's estimates every quarter. Not just meet it, hit it on the nail. Because if you go too far or too bad, you get crushed. And the people that are telling you are people that are running pension funds that don't understand your business anyway. So it's hell. That said, you get to a certain size, that is one of the few paths left open to you, particularly if you have employees that have shares. It's a way of providing liquidity to those people. And I have to admit that there is a certain small, tiny piece of me that is intrigued by the idea of how do you build a culture-first company in the public market, because that's a really hard thing. And the thing I love more than anything is doing things that people tell you can't do. So that bit slightly intrigues me, but if it happens, it'll happen sometime in the future. And if we do it, we'll do it because we believe it gives us the greatest possible opportunity to be a culture-first company at scale, not because I need to buy a yacht or do something like that.
Well, it sounds like Blackbird's a good partner too.
Mm-hmm. Blackbird's been fantastic to us.
Let me go through some of these. Which other company's culture is an inspiration to you? That's a great question.
Yeah. So
Xenia's got top 2, mate. Thank you, Xenia.
So I'd answer in a couple of different ways. One company that's really inspired me on the journey is Patagonia and Yves Chapard. Partly because, going back to our mission in terms of building a culture-first company at scale, Patagonia is not the most environmentally sustainable company in the world. They're not the one that did that better than anybody else. But what they did do was when they started building a global business, everybody was saying you cannot build a business like you're building and focus on environmental sustainability. You have to choose. And they said, bugger off, we're not going to. We're going to build a business around this. And for me, that's very much the thing that I'm trying to do too. People say you have to choose between being a big successful company and being culture first. I want to say bugger off, I'm going to build that by being this. And so Patagonia was hugely important to me. Pixar, Ed Catmull, who's the CEO at Pixar, I grew up working in computer graphics. For anybody that's in that space, Ed Catmull is also known for the Catmull-Rom B-spline. He's a mathematician. He basically invented some of the basic geometric things that we use. So this is a guy that is a phenomenally smart published mathematician who is also running this incredibly creative company. So I find that just endlessly fascinating.
And they rarely have Well, they never have a dud movie, really.
They're the only studio, they're no longer an independent studio, they're the only independent studio that never had a dud. They never had a film that made less than 100 million in revenue. So I think the nearest win rate to that's like 30%. So they're phenomenal.
Yeah, I'm fascinated with their their approach. It's always creative genius, collective creativity. Is that the best way to put it?
Yeah, I mean
there's a lot of candor.
Yeah, they're pretty interesting models. So those are two companies that come to mind.
How to create and maintain great culture with remote teams. This is a good one.
Especially startups.
Yeah.
If you have the answer, come and tell me. It's hard. I mean, we have 4 offices. So San Francisco, New York, London, and Melbourne. We're at 250 people now. Remote's hard. Time zones are hard. In a company like us now, it's a minimum of 48 hours to land a message if that's all you're doing. It's so different to when you're 5 people in a room and you turn around and go, hey, that thing we're going to launch? Let's not launch it. That's shit. Let's go do this. Done. You try doing that in a company with 4 offices and 48 hours is best case. It's probably more like 2 weeks. So it's hard. Remote teams are hard. I mean, we're lucky we've worked with, a lot of the amazing remote first companies like, Automatic and Envision and places like that. I think what I've seen is the companies that do that really well are remote first. So I remember when we talked to Automatic, they had 250 people and they had the most people they had in any one city was 4. So they had 250 people spread across all these different cities and they found ways to make that work. I think the thing that most of us struggle with is when you have most of your people in offices and then you have a remote workforce too, managing that balance is really, really hard. So I don't have good answers for you other than to acknowledge it's really hard. And it's something we struggle with. We struggle with that too. We haven't found the perfect answer.
How do you use space and environment to facilitate culture? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, there's actually someone at Culture Amp, Chloe, who's one of our people scientists, and this is a particular interest of hers. I have 2 thoughts on this. The first one is, sometimes I think people fool themselves when they think about this question in that they think that the reason that Google or Pixar or something is creative is because of their space. It's usually the other way around. The most creative places are often shitty spaces. They're unergonomic, dangerous, horrible places, but somehow creativity thrives instead of. What I think you see well is when people bring, and we were having a conversation earlier about this, insight into social dynamics and how to create things that happen that might otherwise not. So how do you design that space so that people do see other people and how they do share space? So I sit on the board for the Alfred Health Foundation, and they're talking at the moment about the big problem they have in medicine is everybody spends 20 years specializing to the point where they only talk to people that know exactly what they know. And yet there's a person sitting over there that has all this knowledge that if they could just get them together, there'd be this great way to use it. And so space and the way you think about that can really help collaboration and other things, and it can set the right scene and echo the culture, but it has to come from the culture and it has to come from the people as opposed to being imposed. If that wasn't true, go into any one of the big banks, big consulting companies, they spend more money on their space than anybody else, and I've seen less spaces than I'd like to work in.
Absolutely. Just because I can't get to the next question.
There we go, there's the next one.
There you go. Culture Amp operates B2B model, but relies on individual users within, this must be like voice activated, so I don't know who's doing this right now. Within a company, do you think like a B2C?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Interestingly, when I started Culture Amp, the kind of zeitgeist in the Valley was that B2B was deathly boring and everything cool was B2C. And I remember watching all the YC demo day companies and I'm like, these are kind of fun, but I'm not interested in working on a dating app or a whatever. I spend all my time at work. I want to solve a problem at work. I'm going to go do something even if everybody else thinks it's a dumb idea. And so the whole concept of B2B and enterprise was actually deeply unsexy 6, 7, 8 years ago. And so it was kind of fun because everybody else thought what you were doing was not. So for me, B2B means that we're trying to solve a problem at work as opposed to a problem in somebody's personal life or something that they're trying to optimize for what they do when they're not working. And that comes from an obvious thing that we spend so much time at work, let's get it right. For us, we have a clear understanding who the buyer is. That buyer is often in HR and we focus on those. But if the end value is going to be successful, the value has to accrete to somebody outside of that. And in fact, for us, we have to give every individual a voice. We have to engage every individual in the process. And there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff going on around data at the moment, which is the history of people analytics is the collection of data on the many for the benefit of the few. And that has to change. from a legal point of view, from a moral point of view, and from a whole bunch of other things. And so part of the future, like the honest truth is now, us or any other tool, 90% of the people that complete a survey don't see anything back and don't do anything with it. And how do you engage people in that process and how do you connect that? For us, the person we focus on, the persona we call it is Casey, and Casey is the manager. Because that is the person who the company has asked to be responsible for other people. And most people are really struggling. They're really struggling to do that. And how do we help those people do it better, listen better to their people, engage in things that will make them more successful, collect the data that they can use to make better decisions? So for us, that's where we focus. That's how we answer that question. It's not in a B2C world, but it's definitely around user engagement and specific user engagement. And we have metrics around it. Casey.
Casey's the one. Happened to be, it was Mikkel from Zendesk that also told me very hard to make help desk software sexy.
Yeah?
But he managed to do that.
They've done pretty well.
They sure have.
And in fact, one of my big hires 2 years ago, who's still with us, our Chief Growth Officer, was the VP of Marketing at Zendesk from 10 to 100 million, JD Pedersen. And
they probably don't want to hear that story. You're taking one of their best guys.
No, I mean, it's one of the things that any great growth story, and I look at it now, when I look back 15 years from now, I want to be proud of what we did, and I want to be proud of the people in it, but I'm probably going to be prouder of what the people did when they left the company. Absolutely. And that, PayPal, the mafia, they're all mad, but what they've done for the world of tech is phenomenal. And so it's the same thing, and I'm sure Mikkel's the same.
Absolutely. Well, we'll get that doobie next time.
Yeah.
Everyone back on their feet. And a big thank you to Didier for coming out tonight.
I want to answer the rest of the questions. How do I answer the rest of the questions?
Let's see what we got. Well,
it's 19 questions.
Was there?
Yeah, it's on top.
Here we go. All right, we'll take one more. Forget that. We'll do another round of applause in a minute. Most popular. I've never had to do this. Sorry, guys. I
like answering these questions. It's all these good questions. I can answer them. I can answer that one. But this is what you call the Cobra effect. Does anybody know the Cobra effect? So there's a really great book called Prime to Perform, written by Neil Doshi and Lindsay McGregor, and they talk about this theory of total motivation and why oftentimes when we try and measure something, we get the reverse thing that what we want. And so the example that they use is called the Cobra effect. And so they look back to when the English were attempting to run the various cities in India. And one of the things that they would, bring these English people, generals, etc., come out to run the city. And the one thing that they were totally petrified by was the cobras. Because, back in England, you get a little grass snake that's about that big. Now they've got this cobra sitting up spitting at them. They're like shit scared of them. They're like, get rid of the cobras. And so what they did is they put a bounty. They would pay X dollars for every dead cobra. And so the cobras started piling up. And they're like, this is good. Like, we're getting more and more cobras. So what do you think happens when you're paying people for dead? They started breeding the cobras. And so it took a little while for them to realize that, oh shit, they're breeding the cobras. And so then the powers that be went, well, this won't happen. Remove the bounty. Now what happens? Release the cobras, because there's an economic value of 0. So now the city is full of cobras. And so the point was, they were trying to get dead cobras, and they did it by incentivizing it with money, and they ended up with lots of live cobras. That's what happened there. In a nutshell.
Let's see. We'll take one more. We'll take one more here. Yeah, go on. There you go.
From the floor. Make it real.
Yeah, go on.
No technology.
Yeah, no, forget it.
Thanks. So we've touched on this in a bunch of the questions before, but maybe, to sort of summarize it, what are the key things that really determine a culture in a company? Maybe especially from an innovative startup perspective, where it's all about collaboration. I run a co-working space as well. What is it that really determines the culture?
So I think the way I think about culture is there's no such thing as a perfect culture. So first of all, that's a cult. Like, a good culture is the one that is right for you, and it will be right for the problem and the people that you bring together. And it's about being realistic. It's about holding the mirror up and being accountable for what you see. It's about realizing that if you're going to grow, the people have to grow. So you have to look at the people around you and say, if we're all going to grow together, I have to find a way to help you grow. That's the starting point. And then I think about it in terms of values and what's the essence or the core of this culture. And your values are not, they could be, but they're not usually teamwork, honesty, integrity, respect, etc., which is what we all have in our value statements, which they're kind of like what we believe we're meant to be on a good day. Values are what you're willing to hurt for. Values are things that are meaningful and powerful, and we think about them in terms of they have to be meaningful, they have to be relevant to the business, and they have to be mutual. So they have to be something that is a two-way. This is what the company's going to do for you, but this is what you have to do for the company. And the way I would express that it works the best is, who's seen As Good as It Gets? The film with Helen Hunt and Jack Nicholson. And he's this kind of guy suffering with mental illness. And Helen Hunt and he start this relationship, and she's actually kind of going out of her way to be nice to him, and he's being a total douchebag. And there's this point where he's just treating her really badly. And they're in the dinner. She says, look, why are you doing this? Like, why are you doing this to me? I don't need this, you don't need this. Like, if I'm a pain in the ass, just let's call it quits and be gone. And he turns around and he looks at her and he says, because you make me want to be a better man. And so for me, that's the idea, is the heart of a culture is something that makes you want to be a better version of yourself. And so if you can create something that other people see in that, what they want to be, then you have something that people want to be part of. And that, for me, is the heart of a culture.
I love it. All right, we're going to do it one more time. Let's go again. one more for Didier. Thank you very much, man. Just quickly. Thank you very much. We do this every month. I don't know who I have next month. This is one time I haven't done that yet. We're pretty close to probably Movember, or maybe Paul Bernays from Spaceship come down. Cool. And then the big conference in December, please check it out. There might be a few beers on. One thing we do, usually at the end, if you got the floor for 2 minutes, and how can you help everyone here? I want to, without pitching everyone, I'm so-and-so, I'm good at social media, you got the floor. We usually do about 3 or 4. Go on, picking on you. Yeah, what is it? Yeah, why are you here? What are you doing? How can you help everyone?
I'm good at creating videos for Facebook ads.
Good, great. Yeah. Come on, Bill, you want to pick on you, man?
Sharing economy, bootstrapping, and creating community.
Fantastic. Yeah.
I work at Herbert's with Free Hills. We have a program called Startup School, which is a free education program for startups.
We use HSF.
Yeah?
Yep, we've used them on all of our rounds. Peter Dunn's helped us navigate most of our stuff.
Fantastic. There you go. Any more? You got the floor. Let's see you get. What are you here from? No? Marlon? No, come on, man. Zendesk. All right, well, we do this every month.
They've got billboard ads now.
Yeah, they don't have to do it. Hopefully you saw it.
They don't need the floor.
All right. Yeah. Well, thanks for coming, and
Awesome.
have a drink and meet some people. That's what it's about. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Awesome.